The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Catherine's Convent, painting colorful patterns across the old wooden floors. Sister Margaret walked slowly down the corridor, her rosary beads clicking softly with each step. At 72 years old, her movements were careful and measured, but her eyes still held a spark that decades of quiet devotion hadn't dimmed. She paused at the chapel entrance, as she did every morning, and her gaze fell on the grand piano sitting in the corner. It was a beautiful instrument, well-maintained despite being rarely used. The dark wood gleamed in the morning light, and the keys looked pristine, almost untouched. Sister Margaret felt the familiar ache in her chest, the one she'd learned to live with for 47 years. Most people at the convent knew very little about Sister Margaret's life before she took her vows. She was simply the elderly nun who helped in the kitchen, tended the garden, and spent hours in quiet prayer. She never spoke about her past, and nobody asked. That was the way of things here. Everyone had a story, and everyone had left something behind to be here. But what they didn't know was that Sister Margaret had once lived a completely different life. A life filled with concert halls, standing ovations, and her name on billboards. A life where music wasn't just something she did, it was everything she was. Her birth name was Margaret Ann Sullivan. By the time she was 7 years old, her piano teacher had told her parents that she had a gift that came along once in a generation. By 12, she was performing in regional competitions and winning every single one. At 19, she played at Carnegie Hall, and the critics called her performance breathtaking. They said she was destined for greatness, that she would become one of the finest pianists of her time. But here's the thing about destiny. Sometimes it takes turns nobody expects. Sister Margaret ran her fingers along the chapel's doorframe, remembering. She could still recall the feeling of sitting at a grand piano, the audience hushed and waiting, the slight tremor of anticipation before her hands touched the keys. She remembered the way music would flow through her, how it felt like the truest expression of something she couldn't put into words. Then everything changed when she was 25 years old. During a tour in Europe, she found herself in a small church in rural France, seeking shelter from a rainstorm. An elderly nun was playing a simple hymn on an old upright piano. The music was nothing like the complex pieces Margaret performed, but there was something in it that stopped her in her tracks. A peace, a completeness, something she'd been searching for her entire life without knowing it. That chance encounter led to months of soul-searching. She began to feel that all her success and recognition had created a wall between her and something deeper. The applause had become a need, the performances a hunger that was never quite satisfied. She started to wonder if perhaps she'd been playing for all the wrong reasons. When she told her agent she was giving it all up to join a convent, he thought she'd lost her mind. Her family begged her to reconsider. Fellow musicians couldn't understand. How could someone walk away from such a gift at the peak of their career? But Margaret Ann Sullivan did exactly that. She entered St. Catherine's Convent at 25, leaving behind sold-out concert halls and a promising career. She became Sister Margaret, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And part of that obedience meant embracing humility and setting aside the things that had once defined her. Now, standing in the chapel all these years later, she moved closer to the piano. When no one was around, she allowed herself this small indulgence. Just to touch the keys, just to remember. Her weathered hands, marked by years of kitchen work and gardening, hovered over the ivory keys. They looked so different from the young, smooth hands that had once danced across concert pianos. But the memory lived in her fingers, waiting. She pressed a single key, middle C. The note rang out pure and clear in the empty chapel. Sister Margaret? She pulled her hand back quickly, turning to see Sister Anna, one of the younger nuns, standing in the doorway. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," Sister Anna said with a gentle smile. "I was just coming to prepare for morning mass." "Of course," Sister Margaret replied, stepping away from the piano. "I was just passing through." Sister Anna began arranging the altar, but she glanced back at the older nun with curiosity. "Sister Teresa mentioned once that you used to play piano. Before you came here," Sister Margaret nodded slowly. "A long time ago, yes. Would you play something for us sometime? I'm sure everyone would love to hear." The request was innocent, kind even. But Sister Margaret felt her chest tighten. "That part of my life is behind me now," she said softly. "We're here to serve God in humility, not to draw attention to ourselves." Sister Anna looked like she wanted to say more, but she simply nodded and returned to her work. This wasn't the first time someone had asked. Over the years, a few people had discovered hints about her past and suggested she play. But Mother Superior, the head of their convent, had made the position clear many years ago. Personal talents and achievements were to be surrendered in service of their spiritual calling. To perform, to showcase skill, would be contrary to the vow of humility they'd all taken. Sister Margaret understood the reasoning, and she'd accepted it. Most days she was at peace with her choice. She'd found something here that all the applause in the world hadn't given her, a sense of purpose, a connection to something eternal. The silence had taught her things that sound never could. But on quiet mornings like this, when the light hit the piano just right and the chapel was empty, she couldn't help but wonder. Not about fame or recognition. Those things had lost their appeal long ago. But she wondered about the music itself. The gift that had been placed in her hands. Had it been right to set it aside completely, or was there a way it could have served a higher purpose? These were questions she kept to herself, buried deep during prayer and meditation. She'd made her choice, and she believed it was the right one. The life she'd lived before felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. That young woman chasing perfection on concert stages seemed like a stranger now. Sister Margaret left the chapel and made her way to the kitchen, where breakfast needed to be prepared. Her hands, the same ones that had once moved across piano keys with breathtaking speed and precision, now chopped vegetables and kneaded bread dough. It was humble work, simple work, but she'd learned to find holiness in it. Still, as she worked, she hummed. She couldn't help it. Melodies from pieces she'd performed decades ago would drift through her mind, unbidden but welcome. Beethoven, Chopin, Bach. The music had never really left her. It lived somewhere inside, patient and waiting, like an old friend who understood that sometimes people needed space. What Sister Margaret didn't know was that her quiet life was about to change. Someone was coming who would see past the elderly nun in simple robes, someone who would discover who she really was. And once that door opened, there would be no closing it again. But for now, on this ordinary morning, she simply hummed and worked, the music flowing silently through her mind like a river that had been dammed but never truly stopped. The black sedan pulled up to the convent gates on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. David Chen stepped out, adjusting his camera bag on his shoulder and taking in the peaceful grounds before him. He was a documentary filmmaker, though not a particularly famous one. Most of his work focused on finding stories that others overlooked, the quiet lives that deserved to be heard. His latest project was about people who'd chosen lives of devotion and solitude in a world that seemed to be spinning faster every day. He'd visited monasteries, retreat centers, and now he was here at St. Catherine's Convent, hoping to capture something authentic about a way of life most people knew nothing about. Mother Superior met him at the entrance, a tall woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She'd been hesitant about allowing cameras into their home, but after several phone conversations, she'd agreed to let David spend a few days filming, with strict boundaries about what could and couldn't be shown. "We're a community of prayer and service," she explained as she led him through the grounds. "We're not performers and we don't seek attention. But if sharing our story helps people understand the value of a contemplative life, then perhaps it serves a purpose," David nodded, already mentally framing shots of the garden they were walking through, the stone paths worn smooth by decades of footsteps. He'd learned early in his career that the best documentaries came from listening more than directing, from letting stories unfold naturally. Over the next 2 days, he filmed the nuns going about their daily routines, morning prayers in the chapel, working in the vegetable garden, preparing meals together in the kitchen. There was a rhythm to their lives that felt almost musical, each task flowing into the next with purpose and grace. It was on the 3rd day that David noticed the piano. He was setting up to film the evening prayer service when he spotted it in the corner of the chapel. It was a beautiful instrument, clearly well cared for, but something about it caught his attention. It looked expensive, professional grade, the kind of piano you'd see in a concert hall rather than a small convent chapel. "That's a gorgeous piano," he mentioned to Sister Anna, who was helping him understand the evening schedule. "Oh yes," she replied. "We use it for hymns during Mass on Sundays. Sister Margaret plays for us sometimes." "Sister Margaret?" David asked, his filmmaker's instinct picking up on something in the way Sister Anna said the name. "She's one of our elder sisters. She's been here longer than anyone except Mother Superior." Sister Anna paused, then added quietly, Sister Teresa told me once that Sister Margaret was quite accomplished at piano before she joined us. But she doesn't like to talk about it. David's curiosity was instantly piqued. There was a story there, he could feel it. That evening, after the prayer service, he asked Mother Superior about Sister Margaret. She's a very private person, Mother Superior said carefully. Her past life is something she chose to leave behind when she came here. I'd prefer you didn't disturb her with questions about it. But David couldn't let it go. That night in his small room at the guest house, he did what any good documentary filmmaker would do. He started researching. He began with searches about concert pianists from the 1970s, trying different combinations of keywords. Hours passed with nothing concrete. Then around midnight, he tried searching for disappeared pianists and missing classical musicians. That's when he found it. An old article from a music magazine dated 1977. Where did Margaret Ann Sullivan go? The piece discussed how one of the most promising young pianists of the decade had simply vanished from the classical music world. She'd canceled a major tour with no explanation, and despite numerous attempts by journalists and fellow musicians to locate her, she'd never been found. David's hands trembled slightly as he clicked through more articles. There were performance reviews calling her a prodigy, a once-in-a-generation talent. There were photos of a young woman with dark hair seated at a grand piano. Her fingers caught mid-flight across the keys. There was even a grainy video clip of her performing at Carnegie Hall at age 19. And even through the poor quality recording, her skill was undeniable. And then, nothing. After 1977, Margaret Ann Sullivan disappeared completely from public record. David sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Could it be the same person? Sister Margaret would be about the right age. The timing fit perfectly, but he needed to be sure. The next morning, he approached Mother Superior again, this time with printouts of the articles he'd found. I need to show you something, he said, spreading the papers across the table in her office. Mother Superior's face remained calm as she looked at the images, but David saw her fingers tighten slightly on the edge of the desk. Is this Sister Margaret? He asked gently. There was a long silence. Mother Superior looked at the photos of the young pianist, then back at David. Finally, she spoke. What you do or don't film here is guided by what serves our community and respects our way of life, she said, not confirming or denying anything. Sister Margaret chose this path deliberately. She's not hiding from anything. She simply found something more meaningful than fame. I understand, David said quickly. But don't you see what this could mean? This isn't just a story about someone who walked away. It's about someone who found what really mattered. That's powerful. That's exactly the kind of story people need to hear. And in telling that story, you would disrupt the peace she's found here. You would bring attention she doesn't want and never asked for. I'd be respectful. I'd only film if she agreed. And think about what it could do. Not just the story, but imagine if she played again. Really played. Not just hymns, but the way she used to. That gift doesn't just disappear. Mother Superior stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. That gift, as you call it, is hers to do with as she chooses. She chose to offer it to God in a different way. I'm sorry, but I can't allow you to pursue this. David left her office feeling frustrated but not defeated. He'd been a filmmaker long enough to know that sometimes the best stories were the ones that took the most patience to uncover. That afternoon, he was packing his equipment, preparing to leave, when he saw her. Sister Margaret was in the garden, kneeling beside a row of tomato plants, her hands working the soil. She looked so ordinary, so peaceful, that for a moment David questioned whether he'd been chasing shadows. But then she paused in her work and looked up at the sky. Her profile caught the afternoon light, and David saw it. The same elegant line of her neck from those old photographs. The same thoughtful expression. It was her. He was certain now. He knew he should leave it alone. Mother Superior had been clear, and he prided himself on being an ethical filmmaker. But something in him couldn't walk away. Not yet. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. Excuse me, Sister Margaret. She turned, and her eyes met his. They were blue-gray, sharp, and intelligent despite her age. I'm David Chen. I've been filming here this week. Yes, I've seen you around, she said pleasantly. I hope you found what you're looking for. Actually, David said, his heart pounding, I think I found something I wasn't looking for at all. I've been researching Margaret Ann Sullivan. The pianist who performed at Carnegie Hall in 1976. Sister Margaret's hands stilled in the soil. For a moment, neither of them spoke. That was a very long time ago, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I know, and I know Mother Superior said no. But before I leave, I just need to ask you one question. David paused, choosing his words carefully. Do you ever miss it? The music? Sister Margaret looked down at her dirt-covered hands, then back at the chapel where the piano sat waiting. When she finally answered, her voice was thick with emotion. Every single day. Those 3 words hung in the air between them, heavy with decades of longing and sacrifice. David knew in that moment that this story was far from over. It was just beginning. David left the convent that evening, but Sister Margaret's words stayed with him. Every single day. Those 3 words carried the weight of 47 years of longing, of sacrifice, of something precious set aside but never forgotten. He drove back to his apartment in the city, but he couldn't stop thinking about her, about the young woman in those old photographs who'd played with such fire and passion, and the elderly nun in the garden whose hands still remembered. This wasn't just a good story anymore. It felt important, like something that needed to be told, but he'd been shut down. Mother Superior had been clear, and he respected that. He'd made a career out of telling stories ethically, with consent, with dignity. Forcing this would betray everything he believed in. Still, he couldn't help wondering, what if Sister Margaret herself wanted to play again? What if all these years, she'd been waiting for permission she didn't know she could ask for? Meanwhile, back at the convent, Sister Margaret couldn't sleep. The conversation with David had stirred something deep inside her, something she'd worked hard to keep quiet. After evening prayers, she lay in her small room, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. She'd been truthful with him. She did miss it. Every single day. But missing something and acting on that longing were 2 different things. She'd made vows. She'd chosen this life deliberately, not out of desperation or escape, but because she genuinely felt called to it. And for 47 years, she'd found peace in that choice. Yet lately, something had been shifting inside her. It started about 6 months ago with the dreams. Night after night, she'd dream of playing piano, not the concert hall performances of her youth, with their pressure and perfectionism. These dreams were different. In them, she'd play in empty churches or in gardens or sometimes in the chapel at St. Catherine's, and the music that flowed from her fingers felt like prayer itself. Pure and honest, with no ego attached. She'd wake from these dreams with tears on her cheeks and a feeling she couldn't quite name. Not regret exactly, but something like it. A sense that perhaps there was unfinished business between her and the gift she'd been given. 3 days after David left, Sister Margaret was sitting in the garden after morning prayers. It was her favorite spot, beneath an old oak tree that had probably been standing long before the convent was built. She often came here to think, to pray, to find clarity. Mother Superior found her there sitting on the wooden bench, her rosary beads in her hands. May I join you? Mother Superior asked. Sister Margaret nodded, moving slightly to make room. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. They'd known each other for over 30 years. Mother Superior had been a young nun herself when Sister Margaret arrived, and they'd grown old together in this place. You've been troubled lately, Mother Superior said finally. It wasn't a question. Sister Margaret didn't deny it. I have. Is it about the filmmaker? About what he discovered? Partly, Sister Margaret admitted. But it's more than that. I've been having dreams. About playing piano again. And I keep wondering if maybe I was wrong. Not about coming here, not about my vows, but about setting the music aside completely. Mother Superior listened, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Sister Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. When I was young, I played for all the wrong reasons. For applause, for recognition. To prove something to the world and to myself. It became an obsession. That's why I left it behind. I needed to strip away all that ego and ambition. She paused, watching a bird hop across the grass in front of them. But what if the music itself was never the problem? What if it was just the way I was using it? These dreams I've been having, they feel different. They feel like prayer. Like maybe all these years of silence were preparing me to play in a completely different way. Not for myself, but as an offering. Mother Superior was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, What are you saying, Sister Margaret? I think God is calling me to play again. Not to go back to the concert halls and the fame, but to use the gift I was given in service of something greater. I think all these years weren't about burying the talent I had. They were about transforming it. The words hung in the air between them. Sister Margaret had never spoken this directly about it before, not in all her years at the convent. I've been thinking about this too, Mother Superior said slowly. When that young man came here with his discovery, my first instinct was to protect you, to protect our community from outside attention. But I've been praying about it since he left, and I keep coming back to something that troubles me. She turned to look at Sister Margaret directly. In our pursuit of humility, have we been practicing something else entirely? Have we been hiding the light we're meant to share? Sister Margaret's eyes widened slightly. This wasn't what she'd expected, Mother Superior continued. The Bible tells us not to hide our lamp under a basket, and I wonder if that's what we've been doing. Not out of malice, but out of a misunderstanding of what humility really means. True humility isn't about diminishing ourselves. It's about recognizing that our gifts come from God and should be used for God's purposes. So you think I should play? Sister Margaret asked, hardly daring to hope. I think we should pray about it together. Seriously pray. And if we both feel at peace with it, then yes, but with conditions. Over the next week, the two women spent hours in prayer and discussion. They talked about intention, about service, about the difference between seeking glory and sharing a gift. They consulted with other senior members of the community, gauging how this decision might affect everyone. Finally, they reached a conclusion. Sister Margaret would be allowed to play, but only if certain conditions were met. This wouldn't be about reviving her career or seeking fame. Any money generated from her playing would go directly to the convent's charitable work, particularly their mission helping homeless families in the nearby city. She would remain at the convent, living the same humble life she always had. And most importantly, the music would be offered as a form of ministry, a way to touch people's hearts and point them toward something greater than themselves. The decision made, Mother Superior called David. He answered on the second ring, and his voice was surprised to hear from her. I've been thinking about your proposal, she said, and after much prayer and consideration, Sister Margaret and I would like to take you up on it. With conditions. David could hardly believe what he was hearing. Of course. Whatever you need. I'll respect any boundaries you set. Come back next week, Mother Superior said. Bring your camera. But just you, no crew. We'll keep this simple and respectful. Sister Margaret is going to play. When David arrived the following Tuesday, his hands were shaking as he set up his equipment. The chapel felt different somehow, charged with anticipation. Several of the younger nuns had gathered, having heard what was about to happen. They'd never heard Sister Margaret play anything beyond simple hymns. Sister Margaret entered the chapel wearing her usual habit, her silver hair tucked beneath her veil. She looked calm, but David noticed her hands trembling slightly as she walked toward the piano. She sat down on the bench, adjusting her position, her fingers hovering over the keys. It had been 47 years since she'd truly played. 47 years of silence, of longing, of transformation. What will you play? David asked softly, his camera already rolling. Sister Margaret closed her eyes. Moonlight Sonata. It was always my favorite, and it feels right for this moment. Something born from darkness, finding its way to light. She took a deep breath, whispered a prayer, and let her fingers touch the keys. The first notes rang out, tentative at first, as if her hands were remembering something they'd been forced to forget. But then, like a river finding its course after a long drought, the music began to flow. The first notes were hesitant, like someone testing the temperature of water they hadn't touched in decades. Sister Margaret's fingers moved slowly across the keys, reacquainting themselves with the feel of ivory and the spaces between notes. The opening of Moonlight Sonata emerged softly, almost whispered, as if afraid to disturb the silence that had reigned for so long. David stood frozen behind his camera, barely breathing. The other nuns who had gathered sat motionless in the pews, their eyes fixed on the elderly woman at the piano. Then something extraordinary happened. About 30 seconds into the piece, Sister Margaret's posture changed. Her shoulders relaxed, her head tilted slightly to one side, and suddenly the music transformed. What had been tentative became fluid. What had been hesitant became confident. It was as if 47 years of silence had never happened, as if her hands had been playing every single day and were simply picking up where they'd left off. But it was more than just technical skill. Something deeper was happening. The notes that filled the chapel weren't just sounds. They were emotions made audible. Every ounce of longing Sister Margaret had felt over the decades poured through her fingers. Every moment of sacrifice, every quiet morning when she'd walked past the piano and felt that ache in her chest. Every dream she'd had of playing again. It all flowed out in waves of sound that seemed to physically move through the air. Tears began streaming down her weathered cheeks, but she didn't stop playing. Her eyes were closed now, and her body swayed gently with the music. She looked lost in it, or perhaps found in it. It was hard to tell which. Sister Anna, sitting in the front pew, felt her own tears start to fall. She'd never heard anything like this. She'd been to concerts before joining the convent, had heard skilled musicians perform, but this was different. This wasn't a performance. This was a prayer made of music. This was a soul speaking in the only language it had truly mastered. The second movement of the sonata brought a shift. The gentle melancholy of the first movement gave way to something more urgent, more alive. Sister Margaret's fingers moved faster now, more assured, dancing across the keys with a precision that seemed impossible for someone her age who hadn't practiced in nearly 5 decades. David's hands were shaking so badly, he had to adjust his grip on the camera. He'd filmed hundreds of hours of footage in his career, but he'd never captured anything like this. He could feel it in his bones. This was special. This was the kind of moment that comes along once in a lifetime. Mother Superior stood at the back of the chapel, one hand pressed to her heart. She'd known Sister Margaret for over 30 years, had prayed beside her, worked beside her, shared silence with her. But she'd never truly known her until this moment. She'd never understood what her friend had given up, what it had cost her to walk away from this gift. And yet, watching her now, Mother Superior realized something profound. Sister Margaret hadn't actually given anything up. She'd transformed it. The music pouring from her now wasn't the same as what she'd played in her youth. You could feel it in every note. This wasn't about showing off skill or chasing perfection. This was about offering something pure, something that had been refined by decades of prayer and silence and surrender. The third movement exploded into the chapel with urgent energy. Sister Margaret's whole body was engaged now, her fingers flying across the keys, her arms moving with a grace that defied her age. The music swelled and crashed like waves, building to crescendos that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Some of the younger nuns had never even heard Moonlight Sonata before, but they didn't need to know the piece to understand what was happening. They were witnessing something sacred. A gift that had been buried for decades was being unearthed, not diminished by time but somehow deepened by it. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The final notes faded into silence. Sister Margaret's hands lifted from the keys and came to rest in her lap. She sat perfectly still for a moment, her head bowed, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence in the chapel was as profound as the music had been. Finally, Sister Margaret opened her eyes. She turned slightly on the piano bench and looked at the small gathering of her sisters. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. Not a polite smile or a shy smile, but a radiant smile of complete peace. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for letting me do that." Sister Anna was the first to move. She stood up from her pew and then she started clapping. Within seconds, all the other nuns joined her. It wasn't a thunderous applause like you'd hear in a concert hall. It was gentle, reverent, but heartfelt. David stopped recording and lowered his camera. He wiped his eyes, not even caring that he was crying in front of everyone. He'd gotten what he came for, but it was so much more than he'd imagined. After the other nuns had left, David approached Sister Margaret, who was still sitting at the piano, her hands resting on the closed lid. "That was incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't even have words for what I just witnessed." Sister Margaret looked up at him, and there was a lightness in her eyes he hadn't seen before. "It felt like coming home," she said simply, "like finding a part of myself I thought was lost forever." "The world needs to see this," David said. "Not for your sake, but for theirs. People need to know that it's never too late, that gifts don't disappear, they just wait." Sister Margaret considered this. A week ago she might have refused, but something had shifted in her during those 15 minutes at the piano. She'd felt God's presence in the music in a way she never had before, not even in her youth when she was technically more skilled. The silence hadn't diminished her gift. It had sanctified it. "All right," she said, "but we do this on our terms. Any attention that comes from this, we use it to help others. The work we do with the homeless shelter, with struggling families, that's what matters." That evening, David returned to his apartment and began the careful work of editing the footage. He kept it simple, just as he'd promised. No fancy cuts or dramatic music. Just Sister Margaret, the piano, and the chapel. Just the truth of what had happened. He uploaded a 2-minute clip to his social media accounts around 10 o'clock that night. He wrote a simple caption explaining who Sister Margaret was, what she'd walked away from, and what she'd just done after 47 years of silence. Then he went to bed, expecting maybe a few hundred views by morning. Perhaps a few thousand if he was lucky. He woke up 6 hours later to his phone buzzing nonstop. Bleary-eyed, he checked his notifications, and his heart stopped. The video had been viewed 3 million times in 6 hours, and the numbers were climbing by the second. The comments were pouring in from all over the world. Professional musicians saying they'd never heard Moonlight Sonata played with such emotion. People saying they'd cried watching it. Atheists saying they'd felt something spiritual. Music teachers sharing it with their students. News outlets requesting permission to feature it. David sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone in disbelief. He'd known the video was special, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. By noon, the video had 15 million views. By evening, it was 30 million. Major news networks were calling. Record labels were reaching out. The convent's phone was ringing off the hook. Sister Margaret's life was about to change in ways she never could have predicted. The quiet nun who'd spent 47 years in humble service was about to become a global phenomenon. And the question everyone would soon be asking was simple but profound. What do you do when the thing you gave up becomes the thing the whole world wants to see? The convent's old rotary phone hadn't stopped ringing in 3 days. Sister Anna had been assigned to answer it, and she was overwhelmed. News stations from 5 different countries, magazine journalists, a representative from a major record label, even a famous talk show host's assistant, asking if Sister Margaret would be willing to appear on television. Sister Margaret herself watched all of this from a distance, feeling oddly detached from the chaos. It was strange to be at the center of a storm while feeling so calm. She'd lived through fame once before when she was young, and it had nearly consumed her, but this time felt different. This time, she knew exactly who she was. Mother Superior called an emergency community meeting that evening. All 23 nuns gathered in the common room, and the tension in the air was palpable. Some were excited about the attention, others were worried it would destroy the peaceful life they'd built. "Sisters," Mother Superior began, "we need to decide together how to handle what's happening. This affects all of us, not just Sister Margaret." One of the older nuns, Sister Catherine, spoke up. "This is exactly what we try to avoid here. Fame, attention, the world pressing in on our sanctuary. Maybe we should ask them all to leave us alone." Sister Margaret nodded slowly. "I understand that concern, I do. When I was young, the attention nearly destroyed me. But I've been praying about this constantly since the video was posted, and I keep feeling the same thing. What if this isn't about me at all? What if this is an opportunity to do something good?" "What do you mean?" Sister Anna asked. "The record label that called, they're offering a significant amount of money for an album. We could refuse it, go back to our quiet life, or we could accept it, with the condition that every single penny goes to our work with the homeless shelter and struggling families. We've been trying to expand that program for years but never had the funding." She paused, looking around at her sisters. "And all those interview requests, those aren't just about me. They're opportunities to talk about this life we've chosen, about finding meaning in simplicity, about service. How many people get a chance to share that message with millions?" The room was quiet as everyone considered her words. Mother Superior spoke next. "Sister Margaret makes a good point, but we need to be very careful. We set strict boundaries. No cameras inside the convent beyond the chapel. Sister Margaret doesn't leave here for appearances or tours. Everything is done on our terms, and the moment it starts to feel wrong, we stop. Can we all agree to that?" Slowly, one by one, the nuns nodded their agreement. Over the next 2 months, Sister Margaret's life transformed in unexpected ways, though she never left the convent grounds. A small recording studio was set up in one of the empty rooms, and she spent her mornings there recording an album of sacred music. Hymns, classical pieces with spiritual themes, even a few original compositions she'd been working on in her mind for years. The label executives wanted to call it The Return of Margaret Ann Sullivan, but she refused. Instead, they settled on Sacred Silence music from St. Catherine's. The cover photo showed just her hands on the piano keys, her face not visible. She insisted on that. This wasn't about her identity. It was about the music and what it pointed toward. She gave exactly 3 interviews, all conducted at the convent, all focused not on her dramatic story, but on the lessons she'd learned about surrender, transformation, and finding peace. When interviewers tried to make it about her comeback, she gently redirected them. "I'm not making a comeback," she explained in one interview. "I never left. The music was always there, just waiting for the right time. And the right time had nothing to do with my schedule. It had to do with God's." The album released in January and debuted at #1 on the classical charts. More importantly, it raised over $800,000 for the convent's charitable work. The homeless shelter they supported was able to expand, doubling their capacity. Families who'd been living in cars got temporary housing. Children got warm meals and a safe place to sleep. Sister Margaret received thousands of letters from people around the world. Many came from musicians who'd given up their art for various reasons and felt inspired to try again. Others came from people facing their own crossroads, wondering if it was too late to change direction or pursue a forgotten dream. One letter in particular touched her deeply. It was from a 68-year-old woman who'd been a painter before her husband got sick. She'd spent 20 years caring for him, and after he passed, she felt like she'd forgotten how to hold a brush. But watching Sister Margaret's video gave her courage to try again. She enclosed a small watercolor painting of a sunrise. Her first piece in 2 decades. Sister Margaret kept that painting in her room, a reminder that sometimes our stories give other people permission to write their own. The biggest moment came in March, when a major charitable organization approached the convent about a benefit concert. They wanted Sister Margaret to perform live just once to raise money for homeless services across the entire region. The potential impact was enormous. They estimated it could raise over $2 million. Sister Margaret prayed about it for a week. She'd sworn she wouldn't leave the convent, wouldn't step back into the world of performance and spectacle. But this felt different. This wasn't about her. It was about families who needed help. She agreed with conditions. It would be held in a church, not a concert hall. Tickets would be affordable, with many given away free to people who couldn't pay. There would be no backstage meet and greets or photo opportunities. She would play, and then she would return home. The concert took place on a Sunday evening in late March. The church held about 800 people, and every seat was filled. Sister Margaret walked onto the simple stage wearing her habit, her silver hair visible beneath her veil, and the entire audience rose to their feet. She sat at the grand piano, adjusted the bench, and looked out at the crowd. For just a moment, she was 25 again, about to perform at Carnegie Hall, her heart racing with ambition and fear. But then the moment passed, and she was simply herself. Sister Margaret, 72 years old, at peace. She played for 90 minutes. Sacred music, classical pieces, and one surprise at the end, a jazz improvisation based on a hymn, something spontaneous and joyful that had the audience laughing and clapping along. She'd never done anything like that in her youth. Back then, she'd been too concerned with perfection. Now she was free to just play. When she finished, the standing ovation lasted 10 minutes. People were crying, laughing, holding each other. Sister Margaret took a single bow, pressed her hand to her heart, and quietly left the stage. The concert raised $2.3 million. Sister Margaret returned to St. Catherine's that night and never performed publicly again. But she did continue playing. Every morning after prayers, she spent an hour at the chapel piano. Sometimes other nuns would come and listen. Sometimes she played alone. It didn't matter. The music wasn't for an audience anymore. It was a conversation between her and something greater. She also started teaching. Through video calls, she gave free piano lessons to underprivileged children from all over the world. Her lessons were unique. She taught technique, yes, but she also taught them about patience, about practice as a form of meditation, about finding joy in the process rather than just the result. One day, about a year after the viral video, David visited the convent again. He found Sister Margaret in the garden, her usual spot beneath the oak tree. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Walking away from your career when you were young?" Sister Margaret thought about the question for a long moment. I used to think my life was divided into two parts, before and after, the pianist and the nun, but I realize now it was always one journey. Everything that happened, even the silence, was preparing me for this. I had to lose the music to understand what it really was. I had to give it away to get it back in a form I could actually use. She looked toward the chapel where the piano waited. When I was young, I played to prove something, to show the world I was special, but I was chasing something that could never satisfy me. Now I play because it's who I am. Not what I do or what I achieve, but who I am at my core, and that's a gift I could never have found without the silence. David smiled. You know, your story has changed a lot of lives, right? I still get messages from people who saw that video. Teachers sharing it with students. Parents showing it to their kids. People finding courage to try again. That's the thing about stories, Sister Margaret said softly. They're never really just about us. They're about what our experiences might illuminate for someone else. I didn't play again for me. I played because maybe someone needed to see that it's never too late. That nothing is ever really wasted if we're willing to let it be transformed. She stood up slowly, her old bones creaking, and started walking back toward the convent. Then she paused and turned back to David. You know what I tell the children I teach now? I tell them that talent is a gift, but what you do with it is your choice. You can use it to build yourself up, or you can use it to lift others. And the second option, that's where real joy lives. It took me 47 years to learn that lesson, but I finally did. As the sun set over St. Catherine's Convent, Sister Margaret walked back,